Hello students and welcome to the lecture. So students, as we know that we had started the historical background of the Indian Constitution. Okay, that's the topic, and since last few lectures we have been discussing over it. All right, and basically these are the topics that we have scheduled for the discussion, like starting with the introduction part, thereafter the Company Rule 1773 to 1858, the Crown Rule 1858 to 1947, the interim government 1946, the first cabinet of free India 1947. Out of this, we have done with the introduction part, we have done with the company rule, and we have been discussing upon the crown rule. And the topics we are left with is the interim government and the first cabinet of free India. Okay, that's the thing. All right, and basically we know that we had in the previous lecture discussed that how in the starting the Britishers had applied the centralization approach, which later converted into the decentralization approach. Okay, and we had discussed it in detail. Thereafter we had discussed that how they had converted the British oriented approach into the cooperation with Indians approach. Okay, so that is the thing that we had discussed in the previous lecture. So now after discuss the 1861, now we are going to talk about the Indian Council Act of 1892, because in the previous lecture we had discussed that after the revolt of 1857 the Britishers were completely transforming their policy of centralization into the decentralization, and for that's why they had passed the three acts: 1861, 1892 and 1909. Okay, in which they shifted their policy. Okay, that's the thing. But before this, as we had a tradition that the question will be asked to you, so here I'm going to ask you the simple question, like the three, okay, the spelling is wrong, three legislative councils were established by the 1861 Act. So what were these councils? Okay, and what was the year? So for this you have 30 seconds to think an answer, then I am going to give you the answer and your time starts now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. The time's up. So first council was in the Bengal. Second council was in the northwestern frontier, and the third council was in the state of Punjab. Okay, and if we talk about the years, so the first council was established in the 1861, the second council was established in the 1886, and the third council was established in the 1897. So that is the question that is important from the examination point of view. All right, and besides this, so many other things we had discussed in detail. So I hope that you have revised those things before you have come for this lecture, because everything is interdependent on each other. Like there was first act which passed, thereafter the provisions were modified, and the second act was passed, thereafter the modifications done in the second act, and then the third act was passed. So if you haven't revised the first and second, then you won't be able to grasp the facts and figures in the respect of third act, right? So that's why it is necessary that you put your attention and you revise it before going further. All right. So here we have the Indian Council Acts of 1892. So what was this? Let's see. First, it increased the number of additional non-official members in the central and the provincial legislative councils, but maintained the official majority in them. Okay, like we had discussed in the 1861 itself, there was a provision for the non-official members to the council, and the Viceroy Lord Canning on that time, he was you can say he was appointed to recommend the names, and we had discussed that who were the non-official members, the persons who had the privilege to discuss the facts and figures during the meetings, but the persons who do not have the voting rights. Okay, so these were the non-official members. What happened? Like in the 1892, the Britishers had indulged more and more Indians into the council as a non-official members, did not provide them with the voting rights, but still they maintained the official majority. Okay. Thereafter, increased the functions of the legislative councils and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executives. Like if we talk about it, so the budgets previously was not applicable to the meetings for the discussion. Okay, it's totally dependent upon the Viceroy and its executives to discuss and then passed. But we had discussed in the previous lecture that Britishers were shifting their policy from the centralization to decentralization. Okay, and in approach of doing this, basically they had put the budget into the discussion during the meetings. Okay, even the question addressing powers were granted to the members in regards to the executives. All right. Thereafter, provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Central Legislative Council by the Viceroy on the recommendations of the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. Okay, that of the Provincial Legislative Councils by the governors on the recommendation of district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars and the chambers. Like if the non-official members are to be adopted, or you can say indulge in the Central Legislative Councils by the Viceroy, so recommendations must be given from the Provincial Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. But when it's the matter of Provincial Legislative Councils, so the governor had the power to recommend the person, but the recommendations for that person was required to come from the district boards, the municipalities, the universities, trade association, zamindars and chambers. Okay, so the act made a limited and indirect provisions for the use of election in filling up some of the non-official seats. Why we call it indirect? Why we call it indirect? Because general public were not electing them. Okay, if you look at them, then their electoral college was not open for the general public, but was open for some specific institutions. So that's why there was the indirect provision. The word election was, however, not used in the act anywhere. The process was described as a nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies. Okay, like these were not the elected members, but nominated members or the recommended members. Okay. After this, in the 1892, we had the third act in a row, which is the Indian Council Act of 1909. Okay, and the act is also known as the Morlow-Minto reforms. That is very, very important. Like sometimes the nickname of this act comes in the examination, like Morlow-Minto reforms, this and that. So many times it happened that the student get confused. Like he had studied about the Indian Council Act of 1909, and here the Morley-Minto reforms presented on the paper. So how to connect it? The simple way is just learn this in the way. Indian Council Act of 1909, also known as Morley-Minto reforms, and Morley-Minto reforms, also known as Indian Council Act of 1909. Why it is known as the Morley-Minto reforms? Because the Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India, okay, and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India. And we had discussed in the previous lecture also, like the Viceroy was responsible for the crown of the Britain, and the Secretary of State for India was responsible for whom? Was responsible for the British Parliament. Okay. So, what was the feature of this act? It considerably increased the size of the legislative councils at both the central and the provincial levels. That was the first thing. The number of members in the central legislative councils were raised from 16 to 60. Okay. It means that is also in the favor of decentralization. Like the more the members, the more the discussion would happen. So basically that was an approach adopted during this time. The number of members in the provincial legislative councils was not uniform. Like if we talk about center, that center they increase uniformly 16 to 60. But when we talk about the provincial legislative councils, so that's why the you can say that was according to the size and according to the need and the demand of that time. So that's why there was a uniformity at center level, but there was no uniformity at the provincial levels. Okay. Retain the official majority in the central legislative councils, but allowed the provincial legislative councils to have non-official majority. Okay. It means that at the central legislative councils, the official members were high than non-official members. But at the provincial levels, non-official members were high than the official members. So that was a thing. Thereafter, enlarge the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both levels. For example, members were allowed to ask the supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. Okay. Then provided for the first time for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and the governors. Like if we talk about the councils, whether it's the Viceroy or the governors, if we talk about it, then we know there are the two forms of councils. First form is legislative councils. Second form is executive councils. Okay. So through the first two acts in the 1861 and 1892, legislative councils were got open for Indians, but the executive councils were closed. But in the 1909, executive councils were also open for the Indians. Okay, so Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy Executive Council. He was appointed as an law member. Okay, so remember the name. It is very important from the examination point of view. Got it? Introduce a system of communal representation for Muslim by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected by the Muslim voters only. Thus, the act legalized the communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. So what happened? Like whosoever would be the member of the Viceroy councils, okay, and the provincial councils, okay, if the member is Muslim, then he could only be appointed by the Muslim voters. Non-Muslim voters were not allowed to vote for him. Okay, and that is the communalism, or we could call it as a communal electorate. So Lord Minto was the first person to introduce this, so that's why he is known as the father of communal electorate. Remember this thing. Also provided for the separate representation of presidency's corporation, chamber of commerce, universities, and the zamindars. Okay, so these were the things also provided. Now, thereafter, another important thing was the Government of India Act 1919. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was to the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. The Government of India Act 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. So 1919 is an introduction year and 1921 is an implementation year. This also known as the Montagu Chelmsford Report. Remember this thing. Montagu Chelmsford reforms. Okay, the similar thing like the 1909, Montagu was the Secretary of State for India, responsible to the British Parliament, and Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy, responsible to the Crown of the Britain. So what were the features of this act? The first, relax the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and the provincial subjects. Okay, it means that for the first time the division regarding which subjects are at the central level and which subjects are at the provincial levels, that was done. The central and the provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and the unity, which means that basically the provinces were allowed to make the rules with the autonomy on the provincial subjects. The center was allowed to make the rules with autonomy on the central subjects, but still the centralization and the unity in the structure of the government was maintained. Thereafter, further divided the provincial subjects into the two parts known as the transferred and the reserved subject. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of minister responsible to the legislative councils. Okay, it means that whosoever would be the governor of that province, he will take the aid of the ministers to work on these subjects for the laws and the execution. The reserved subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governor and his executive council only. It means that the legislative council did not have any right to discuss any fact and figure anything about the reserved subjects. Okay, this dual scheme of governance was known as the diarchy. Okay, a term derived from the Greek word diarchy, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. Okay, thereafter, it introduced for the first time the bicameralism and the direct elections in the country. Bicameralism means two houses. Like we know, if we talk about today's term, then the Parliament of India is not one house, it is two houses. Rajya Sabha, representation of the states. Lok Sabha, representation of people. Okay, so similar kind of thing was introduced on that time also. Thus, the Indian legislative councils were replaced by the bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house, which was known as the Council of State, and the lower house, Legislative Assembly. Okay, the majority of members of both houses were chosen by the direct elections. It means that general people allowed to vote. Okay, thereafter it required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy Executive Councils other than the Commander-in-Chief were to be Indian. It means that majority of Indians were ensured, but the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army was only the British. Okay, it extended the principle of communal representation by providing the separate electorates for the Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and the Europeans. Like in the previous 1909, only the Muslims were got the separate electorate. But in the 1990, the provision was extended further, and it was extended up to the Sikhs, the Indian Christians, the Anglo-Indians and the Europeans. Granted franchisee to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax or education. It means that, however, the concept of general election brought to the force, but not with the universal adult franchisee. It means that not everyone allowed to vote, only the certain persons on the basis of property, tax or educations were allowed to vote. He created a new office of High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. Alright, provided for the establishment of the Public Service Commission. Okay, hence the Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926, recruiting civil servants. Separated for the first time the provincial budgets from the central budget, authorized the provincial legislature to enact their budgets. Thereafter, provided for the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. Like it was established in the 1990. So how the act worked and what changes were brought till 1929 means 10 years after in the row, that will be judged by the statutory commission. Okay, and then we know there was a Simon Commission appointed for this. In November 1927, 2 years before the schedule, like in 1929, that was supposed to be appointed, but that was actually appointed in the 1927. That was the 2 years before the schedule. The British government announced the appointment a 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Sir John Simon. That's why it is known as the Simon Commission. He was a member of the British cabinet to report on the condition of India under its new constitution. All the members of the commissions were British and hence all the parties boycotted the commission. Like what happened in the 1919, whatever provisions they had provided, these provisions actually backfired on the British interest in India. Okay, the Britishers were thinking that these provisions were bring the glory to them, but in actual, the Indian majority subjected them for the failure of their various provisions for their own interests. So that's why they had appointed the Simon Commission in the name of Indian Condition Checker, but they put every British in them and there was no Indian on the ground. So that's why the parties boycotted the commission. The commission submitted the report in 1930 and recommended the abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible government in the provinces, establishment of Federation of British in India and the princely states, continuation of communal electorates and so on. That's why that was boycotted. To consider the proposal of the commissions, the British government convened 3 round-table conferences to discuss these things, but British India, the British government and the Indian princely states were you can say invited. On the basis of these discussions, a white paper on a constitutional reforms were prepared and submitted for the consideration of the Joint Select Committee of British Parliament. The recommendation of these committees were incorporated with certain changes in the next Government of India Act 1935. Communal reward is very much similar to the 1909. Like Ramsay MacDonald, who was a British Prime Minister of that time in the 1932, announced the scheme for the representation of the minorities as a communal award. Award was not only continued the separate electorates for the Muslims, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and the Europeans, but also expanded it to the depressed class or the scheduled caste. Gandhiji was distressed over this extension, like he was saying that these peoples were out of the mainstream. Okay, why? Because they are isolating by these provisions. At last, there was an agreement between the leaders of Congress and the depressed class. The agreement, known as the Pune Pact, retained the Hindu joint electorate and gave reserved seat to the depressed class, which is still continue. Thereafter, the Government of India Act 1935 was formed. The Act marked a second milestone towards a completely responsible government in India. It was lengthy and detailed document having the 321 sections and the 10 schedules provided. It provided for the establishment of All India Federation consisting of provinces and the princely states as a unit. It means the center and the provinces for the first time were defined clearly. The Act divided the powers between the center and the units in terms of three lists: the federal list with 59 items, provincial list with 54 items, and the concurrent list to be discussed between the center and the state both, and had 36 items. Residuary powers were given to the Viceroy. It means that those subjects which could not be discussed and put under these lists, those subjects could only be discussed and the action could only be taken by the Viceroy and the Viceroy only. It abolished the diarchy in the provinces and introduced the provincial autonomy in its place. It means that the system of transferred and the reserved subjects were removed and the provincial autonomy was granted. The provinces were allowed to act as an autonomous unit of administration. The Act introduced the responsible government in the provinces, and the governor was required to act with the advice of ministers, not on the indications of the Viceroy. Okay, and this Act came into 1937 and discontinued in the 1939. Provided for the adoption of diarchy in the center. Consequently, the federal subjects were divided into the reserved subjects and the transferred subjects. These provisions of Act did not come into operation at all because we know the Britishers finished this concept. Introduced the bicameralism in 6 out of the 11 provinces. Thus, the legislatures of Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam and the United Provinces were made bicameral, consisting of the legislative councils, the upper house and the legislative assembly, lower house. However, many restrictions were placed on them. Thereafter, the Indian Independence Act of 1947, basically that proposed by the Clement Attlee. Okay, and on June 3, 1947, the British government made it clear that the constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly of India 1946 cannot apply to those parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it, because finally the division was made between India and Pakistan. Okay, and the states were allowed to join any of them as per their will. On the same day, June 3, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of that time, put forth the partition plan known as the Mountbatten Plan. Plan was adopted by the Congress and the Muslim League. Immediate effect was given to the plan by enacting the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Okay. Now, we have the last thing, which is the interim government 1946. So, let's discuss it. First, the Jawaharlal Nehru. He was the Vice President of the Council, External Affairs and the Commonwealth Relations. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Home, Information and the Broadcasting. Rajendra Prasad, Food and Agriculture. John Mathai, Industries and Supply. Jagjeevan Ram, for the Labour. Sardar Baldev Singh, Defence. C.H. Bhabha, Works, Mines and Powers. Liaquat Ali Khan, for the Finance. Abdul Rahab Nistar, Ports and Air. Asaf Ali, Railways and Transport. C. Rajagopalachari, Education and Arts. I. Chundrigar, Commerce. Ghaznafar Ali Khan, Health. And Jogendra Nath Mandal, Law. Okay, These members of the entry government were the members of the Viceroy Executive Councils and directly copy pasted into these portfolios. The Viceroy continued to be the head of the council, but Jawaharlal Nehru was designated as the vice president of the council till the constitution framed for India. Okay, so students, basically in this lecture we had done with the historical background of the Indian Constitution. In the next lecture we will start with some other important new topic. Till then, just revise the facts and figures that we have discussed in this lecture and be ready for the next lecture. With this note, let's end this lecture and thank you.